Captain Takeshi Yamamoto put the pistol to his temple for the third time that week, and for the third time his hand refused to pull the trigger. The shame of this failure was worse than the shame of surrender, worse than the dishonor of captivity, worse than any of the 1,000 humiliations he had endured since the fall of Okinawa. A samurai who could not die with honor was not a samurai at all. He was a ghost wearing the skin of a man. And now, sitting in the psychiatric ward of the American POW facility while rain hammered the corrugated metal roof, he had become something even worse, a specimen being studied by a young American with soft hands and the absurd notion that talking about feelings could heal wounds that honor could not. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. The American's name was Lieutenant David Kellerman, and he was 26 years old, which made him barely older than some of the junior officers in the ward. He had arrived at Camp Ritchie 3 months earlier with a doctorate in psychology from Columbia University, horn-rimmed glasses that made him look like a graduate student, and a complete lack of understanding about what it meant to be Japanese, to be military, or to be broken in ways that talking could never fix. The other Japanese officers called him sensei with barely concealed mockery. They bowed when he entered the room, answered his questions with elaborate courtesy, and ignored every word he said. Major Ishikawa, the senior officer among the prisoners, had made it clear from the beginning they would cooperate with American medical staff for physical ailments, but matters of the spirit were beyond the comprehension of foreigners who knew nothing of Bushido, nothing of honor, nothing of the weight that a samurai carried from the moment he accepted his sword. "You cannot understand," Ishikawa had told Kellerman during their first session, speaking in precise English learned at military academy. "In your culture, a man who feels sadness goes to a doctor who gives him pills or sympathy. In our culture, a man who feels sadness commits seppuku, if the sadness comes from dishonor, or he endures it in silence if it comes from fate. There is no middle ground. There is no talking cure for a destroyed soul." Kellerman had listened with the careful attention that marked everything he did, making notes in his leather journal with fountain pen strokes that seemed too delicate for a military facility. "And yet," he had said quietly, "you're all still alive, which suggests that perhaps there's more than 2 options." The major had not responded to that. None of them had. But now, 3 months later, Captain Yamamoto sat across from Kellerman in the small room that served as the psychology ward's consultation space, and the pistol that he'd hidden in his quarters, constructed painstakingly from parts smuggled over weeks, lay on the table between them. A guard had found it during a routine inspection. Standard procedure would have been solitary confinement, possibly a court-martial if they could prove intent. Instead, Kellerman had requested that Yamamoto be brought to him, and the camp commander, a pragmatic colonel who believed that preventing suicides was preferable to filing paperwork about them, had agreed. "Tell me about the gun," Kellerman said. Yamamoto stared at the crude weapon. It wouldn't have fired more than once, if at all. The barrel was a hollowed pipe, the trigger mechanism salvaged from a lighter and a ballpoint pen spring. It was suicide engineering, meant to work exactly 1 time, at close range, against a target that wasn't moving. "There is nothing to tell," Yamamoto said in English that was better than he'd let the Americans know. "It is a tool for a necessary task." The necessary task of killing yourself? The necessary task of restoring honor. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, and Yamamoto noticed something in the American's eyes that he hadn't seen before. Not pity, which would have been insulting, and not curiosity, which would have been clinical, but something closer to recognition, as if Kellerman understood something that he shouldn't have been able to understand. "What happens after?" Kellerman asked. "After? After you restore your honor. What happens then?" Yamamoto felt anger rise in his chest, the first real emotion he'd felt in weeks. It is not about after. It is about fulfilling obligation, about correcting an unbearable wrong. The wrong of surviving when your men died? The words hit like artillery fire. Yamamoto's hands clenched on his knees, and he fought the urge to leap across the table and show this soft American what violence looked like up close. How dare he speak of things he knew nothing about? How dare he reduce the death of honor to a psychological curiosity? 70 men, Yamamoto said, each word forced through clenched teeth. 70 men under my command on Okinawa. We held Hill 89 for 6 days against your Marines. When the position became untenable, I ordered them to prepare for Gyokusai, honorable death charge. They tied white headbands and drew their swords and waited for my order to attack. But you didn't give the order? I was unconscious. Artillery shell landed 3 meters from our command bunker. When I woke, my men were dead, all of them, killed in the charge that I was supposed to lead. And I was a prisoner, lying in an American medical tent with Americans saving my life like I was something worth saving. Kellerman was silent for a long moment, his pen motionless. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than Yamamoto expected. You were supposed to die with them. Yes, and because you didn't, you believe you failed them? I know I failed them, and the only way to correct that failure is to die now? Yes. Kellerman set down his pen and removed his glasses, cleaning them with a handkerchief, a stalling gesture, Yamamoto realized, while he thought about what to say next. When he put the glasses back on, his expression had changed. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by something more personal. Captain Yamamoto, Kellerman said, I'm going to tell you something that will probably get me reprimanded if my superiors find out, but I think you need to hear it. Yamamoto waited. 3 years ago, I was a graduate student in New York, studying trauma psychology and writing papers about stress response in combat veterans. I had never fired a gun. I had never seen combat. I had never experienced anything that would qualify me to understand what soldiers go through. And then, one night, my younger brother came home from the Pacific Theater on emergency leave. Kellerman paused, and Yamamoto saw something in the American's face that was utterly unexpected. Grief, raw and unhealed. He was a Marine lieutenant, Guadalcanal, then Tarawa. He came back different. Wouldn't talk about what happened, wouldn't sleep, spent hours just sitting and staring at nothing. My parents thought he needed rest. I thought I could help him because I was studying psychology and I knew about trauma. What happened to him? He killed himself. In our garage. Used his service pistol. Left a note that said he was sorry for being weak. The rain continued to hammer the roof, filling the silence that followed. I don't tell you this for sympathy, Kellerman continued. I tell you this because it's why I'm here. After my brother died, I enlisted, requested assignment to POW facilities, because I realized that everything I'd learned in university was theory, and theory is useless when confronting actual human suffering. I needed to understand why my brother thought death was the only option. I needed to know if there was something I could have said, could have done, that might have made a difference. Yamamoto studied the American's face, looking for deception and finding only exhausted honesty. And what have you learned? That honor is the heaviest thing a soldier carries. Heavier than weapons, heavier than fear, heavier than grief, and that sometimes honor becomes so heavy that it crushes the person carrying it. Then you understand why I must do this. No, Kellerman said firmly. I understand why you believe you must do this. There's a difference. Explain the difference. Kellerman leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and spoke with an intensity that was almost urgent. You were trained to believe that honor is binary. You either have it or you've lost it, and losing it means you must die. But what if that's not true? What if honor is something that can be wounded and then healed, like a body? What if surviving when you weren't supposed to isn't a failure, but an obligation to carry forward the memory of those who didn't? That is American thinking. It is not Japanese thinking. Maybe. Or maybe it's just human thinking that's been obscured by cultural training. Captain, I'm not asking you to abandon Bushido. I'm asking you to consider that Bushido might be more complex than the version you were taught. Yamamoto felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw. It was uncomfortable and unwelcome, this feeling of uncertainty where there had always been certainty. The gun, he said, nodding at the crude weapon on the table. Will be destroyed, Kellerman said, and you will continue to live. And we will continue to talk. Not because I can cure you. I don't believe in cures for this kind of wound. But because I believe that talking about it might make the weight a little lighter. And if I refuse? Then you refuse. I won't force you, but I will ask you to consider one thing. What thing? Your 70 men died in a charge you were supposed to lead. You believe you failed them by surviving. But if you kill yourself now, you're choosing to abandon them a second time. Because as long as you're alive, their story lives. Their sacrifice has meaning through your memory. But if you die, who will remember them? Who will tell their story? Who will ensure that their names aren't forgotten? The words struck Yamamoto like physical blows. He had never considered it from that angle, that survival might be its own form of obligation, that living with shame might be harder than dying with honor, and therefore more necessary. You manipulate with words, Yamamoto said, but there was no anger in it. Yes, Kellerman admitted, that's my weapon. Just like you have training in tactics and violence, I have training in language and psychology. We're both soldiers, Captain. We just fight different battles. Yamamoto looked at the gun, then at Kellerman, then back at the gun. He thought about his men, about their faces in the moment before the charge, about the weight of their expectation and trust. He thought about 70 names that would be forgotten if he died, 70 stories that would vanish into the void of history. I will consider what you have said, Yamamoto finally said. I do not promise to agree, but I will consider. That's all I ask. As guards led Yamamoto back to his quarters, Major Ishikawa watched from the window of the officers' common area. He had seen the crude gun being carried to Kellerman's office. He had seen Yamamoto emerge an hour later, not in restraints, not headed to solitary, but walking freely back to quarters. Something had happened in that room, something that might change everything, or nothing at all. Only time would tell, and time, in a POW camp at the end of a brutal war, was the one resource they all had in abundance. The news of Yamamoto's failed suicide attempt spread through the Japanese officers' quarters within hours, carried by whispers and meaningful glances. In a community built on rigid hierarchy and shared understanding of honor, such matters were discussed without ever spoken about directly. Major Ishikawa called a meeting that evening, gathering the 14 senior officers in the common room while rain continued to assault the camp. They sat in a rough circle, as they might have in a military conference, but the topic was far more delicate than tactics or strategy. We must address the situation with Yamamoto, Ishikawa began, his voice pitched low enough that guards outside wouldn't hear.
He has attempted to restore his honor through seppuku. The Americans have prevented this. Now they send him to their psychologist as if shame can be cured like influenza. He should have succeeded, said Colonel Saito, the oldest among them at 56, his face carved from hardwood and ancient discipline. To fail even at this basic duty is additional shame. Or perhaps, said Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, the only Navy officer in the group, the attempt itself was the point. The Americans found the weapon. Perhaps Yamamoto wanted to be stopped. That is cowardice, Saito snapped. That is psychology, Nakamura countered. The Americans believe in it. Maybe they've infected Yamamoto with their thinking. Ishikawa raised a hand for silence. Regardless of Yamamoto's intent, we face a larger question.
The American psychologist, this Lieutenant Kellerman, believes he can treat matters of honor with his talking therapy. If Yamamoto begins to accept these ideas, if he begins to believe that survival is acceptable, what happens to the rest of us? The question hung in the air like smoke. It undermines everything, said Captain Hayashi, an artillery officer who had lost his entire battery at Iwo Jima. If one of us decides that American psychology is valid, that living with dishonor is acceptable, then we all become infected. The dishonor spreads like disease. Or, said Lieutenant Tanaka, the youngest officer at 24, perhaps Kellerman is right. Perhaps we're all suffering, and talking about it might help. The room went silent. Every officer turned to stare at Tanaka, and the young man had the grace to look uncomfortable under their collective gaze. "Explain yourself," Ishikawa said, his voice dangerous. Tanaka swallowed hard, but continued. "With respect, Major, we all know that at least 8 men in this camp have attempted suicide since we arrived. 8 that we know of. How many others have thought about it? How many of us lie awake considering options? We talk about honor and bushido and proper behavior, but we're all haunted, all carrying weight that gets heavier every day. If the American has methods that might make that weight lighter, then we would become Americans," Saito interrupted. "We would lose what makes us Japanese. We would betray our entire culture for the comfort of foreign ideas." "We would survive," Tanaka said quietly. "Survival without honor is not survival. It is a living death. And honor without life is not honor. It is waste." The argument might have escalated, might have fractured the fragile unity that held the officer corps together, but Ishikawa raised his hand again. "Enough. This is not a debate we can resolve tonight. But I propose a test." "What kind of test?" Nakakura asked. "Yamamoto will continue his sessions with Kellerman. We will observe what happens. If Kellerman's therapy is as useless as we believe, Yamamoto will remain haunted and will eventually succeed in his death obligation. If the therapy has some effect, if Yamamoto begins to change, then we will know that the American methods have power. At that point, we can decide whether that power is worth considering. And if Yamamoto becomes corrupted by American thinking," Saito demanded, "if he loses his Japanese spirit, then he will serve as a warning to the rest of us," Ishikawa said, "a demonstration of what happens when one surrenders not just his body, but his mind to the enemy." The officers considered this. It was a cold calculation, using Yamamoto as a test subject. But coldness was something they all understood. Emotion had no place in strategic thinking. "I agree to this test," Saito said finally. One by one, the others nodded their agreement. "Then it is decided," Ishikawa said. "We will watch, we will wait, and we will learn whether American psychology is genuine medicine or simply another form of conquest."
What none of them said, what none of them could admit even to themselves, was that they all hoped Kellerman's methods might work, because each of them carried their own weight of shame and loss and impossible grief, and the thought that talking might help was simultaneously ridiculous and desperately appealing. The sessions continued twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, in the small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Yamamoto attended because Ishikawa had ordered him to, and because refusing would have been its own form of dishonor. But he attended with skepticism intact, ready to prove that American psychology was as useless as everyone believed. Kellerman, to his credit, didn't try to convince Yamamoto of anything. He simply asked questions and listened to the answers with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "Tell me about your men," Kellerman said in their fourth session. "Not how they died, how they lived." Yamamoto hesitated. Talking about the dead felt like disturbing their rest, like using their memory for therapeutic purposes when they had earned peaceful silence. But something in Kellerman's request felt different from the clinical probing he'd expected. "Why do you want to know?" "Because they matter. Because their lives shouldn't be reduced to statistics in a battle report. And because I think you need to remember them as people, not as failures." They were not failures. But you think you failed them, which means, in your mind, their deaths are connected to your failure. I want to separate those things, help you see them as individuals who made choices, not as victims of your inadequacy. Yamamoto considered this. It was manipulation, he knew, a psychological technique designed to reshape his thinking. But it was also oddly respectful, this focus on his men as people rather than abstractions. Private Tanaka, not the lieutenant in the officers' quarters, a different Tanaka, was 19 years old. Yamamoto began slowly. From a farming village in Fukuoka. He wrote letters to his mother every day, even when we had no way to mail them. He kept them in a cloth bag, hundreds of letters, said he would give them to her when he returned home. He knew he wouldn't return home, but he wrote the letters anyway. Kellerman made a note. What did he write about? Everything. The weather, the food, the other soldiers. He wrote about the war without writing about the war. He made it sound like he was on a long camping trip, having small adventures, making his mother worry less. Do you know what happened to the letters? They burned with him, in the charge. Kellerman nodded slowly. Tell me about another one. And so Yamamoto did. Sergeant Yoshida, who had been a school teacher and recited poetry before battle to calm the younger soldiers. Corporal Matsutomo, who could fix any weapon with minimal tools and kept Yamamoto's pistol functioning when regulations said it should have been replaced. Private First Class Sato, who sang traditional songs in a voice that carried across the hills, beautiful and haunting even in the midst of war. The more he talked, the more the men came alive in his memory, not as faceless casualties, but as individuals with quirks and dreams and habits that made them human. And with each story, Yamamoto felt something unexpected, the weight shifting, not disappearing, but distributing differently across his shoulders. These men trusted you, Kellerman said, when Yamamoto had described a dozen soldiers. They followed your orders, fought under your command, prepared to die on your signal. Yes. And when you were wounded, they went ahead without you, made the charge that was supposed to be suicide, knowing you couldn't lead them. Yes. Which means they chose their deaths. You gave them training, leadership, purpose, but in that final moment, they made their own choice, not because you ordered it, but because they understood what was necessary. Yamamoto felt anger flare again. You try to absolve me with words. You try to make it seem like I wasn't responsible? No, Kellerman said firmly. I'm trying to help you see that responsibility and failure aren't the same thing.
You were responsible for your men. That's what command means. But their deaths weren't your failure. They were the tragic consequence of a war that put you all in an impossible situation. That is Western thinking, separating responsibility from outcome. Maybe, or maybe it's accurate thinking. Captain, tell me something. If one of your men had survived instead of you, say Sergeant Yoshida, the school teacher, and he believed he should die because he failed his comrades, what would you tell him? The question caught Yamamoto off guard. He tried to imagine Yoshida sitting where he sat now, carrying the same weight of survivor shame, contemplating the same desperate solution. I would tell him, Yamamoto paused, struggling. I would tell him that he survived for a reason, that his life has value. And why doesn't that apply to you? Because I was the commander, the standard is different. Why? Because Yamamoto stopped. He had never questioned it before, had never examined the assumption that officers were held to different standards of honor. It simply was, because that is what we are taught. What if what you were taught is incomplete? Kellerman leaned forward. What if Bushido, as you learned it, is a version designed for specific military purposes, but not for the complexity of actual human experience? That would mean everything I believe is wrong. Not wrong, incomplete. There's a difference. Yamamoto sat in silence for a long time, feeling the foundations of his understanding shift beneath him. It wasn't comfort that Kellerman offered. It was challenge. The American wasn't telling him that his shame was invalid or his training was worthless. He was asking Yamamoto to consider that there might be more to honor than the binary choice between death and dishonor. I need to think about this, Yamamoto said finally. That's good. Thinking is good. Take as much time as you need. As Yamamoto left the consultation room, he noticed Major Ishikawa watching from across the compound. The major's expression was unreadable, but Yamamoto knew he was being assessed, measured, judged for signs of corruption by American thinking. The test was underway, and Yamamoto was no longer certain which outcome he hoped for. 6 weeks into the therapy, something changed. Yamamoto began to speak more freely during sessions, not just responding to Kellerman's questions, but volunteering thoughts and memories. He talked about his childhood in Kyoto, about the rigid discipline of military academy, about the gap between the idealized version of war they'd been taught and the brutal reality they'd experienced. He talked about fear, about the nights before battle when his hands would shake and he would force them still through sheer will. About the times he'd wanted to run, wanted to quit, wanted to be anywhere but responsible for men's lives. "Does that make me a coward?" he asked Kellerman during one session. "It makes you human," Kellerman replied. "Fear isn't cowardice. Cowardice is letting fear control your actions. You felt fear, but did your duty anyway. That's courage." That is not how we are taught to think about courage. How are you taught to think about it? Courage is the absence of fear. The samurai who faces death without flinching. The warrior who meets his end with perfect serenity. That's not courage. That's psychopathy or fantasy. Real courage is being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. Yamamoto absorbed this. The Western definition felt both wrong and oddly liberating. If courage included fear, then maybe his own terror hadn't invalidated his service. Maybe he had been brave after all, even when he felt like a fraud. "Tell me about Okinawa," Kellerman said. "Not the battle, the island. What was it like?" "Muddy. Everything was mud and rain. We dug our positions into hillsides and lived like animals in holes. The American shelling was constant, day and night, no respite. We couldn't cook food because the smoke gave away positions. We couldn't light fires for warmth. We just existed, in the mud, in the dark, waiting to die. That sounds like hell. It was hell, but we told ourselves it was honorable hell, that suffering for the emperor gave meaning to the suffering. Did you believe that? Yamamoto considered lying, considered giving the answer that a proper Japanese officer should give, but something about Kellerman's steady gaze, about this room where they'd spent hours talking about unspeakable things, made him choose honesty instead. No, I stopped believing it after the first week. I saw what the shelling did to men, saw how death came randomly, not to the cowardly or the brave, just to whoever was unlucky. I understood that we were going to lose, that our deaths would change nothing, that we were dying for a strategy that had already failed. Did you tell your men this? Never. They needed to believe the sacrifice meant something, so I let them believe. I gave them the speeches about honor and duty and necessary sacrifice, and they believed me because I was their commander. That must have been lonely. The word hit Yamamoto like artillery fire. Lonely. He had never articulated it that way, had never allowed himself to acknowledge the isolation of command, knowing the truth while preaching the lie, carrying certainty of failure while demanding displays of faith. Yes, he said quietly, it was very lonely. Is that why you want to die? Not just because you survived when they didn't, but because you feel guilty for lying to them? Yamamoto felt something break open inside his chest. Not the crack from before, but a full rupture, grief spilling out in ways he'd never permitted. His eyes burned, his throat closed, and for the first time since Okinawa, since the moment he'd woken in American hands, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto began to weep. He cried for his men, for their trust that he'd betrayed by knowing the truth, for their letters and songs and small human moments that had been incinerated in a meaningless charge, for the weight of command that had required him to be something more than human while feeling desperately, terribly human. Kellerman didn't speak, didn't try to comfort or fix or explain. He simply handed Yamamoto a handkerchief and waited, letting the grief run its course. When Yamamoto finally regained control, his face was wet and his breathing ragged, and he felt simultaneously emptied and lighter, as if something toxic had been drained from a wound that had been festering for months. "I apologize," he said, the words automatic. "Why? You've earned the right to grieve. A samurai does not show weakness. A samurai is a human being in armor. The armor doesn't erase the human, it just hides him." Yamamoto looked at Kellerman through visions still blurred by tears, and saw not the enemy or the foreigner or the soft American, but simply another man who understood something about suffering. "How do I live with this?" Yamamoto asked, the question naked and desperate. "How do I carry this and not break?" "The same way all soldiers learn to carry it," Kellerman said. "You acknowledge the weight. You share the burden with others who understand. You find meaning in continuing to live, not in ending your life. And you forgive yourself for being human in situations that demanded you be something more. Forgiveness is not a concept in Bushido. Then maybe Bushido is incomplete. Maybe it was designed for a type of war that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it's time to build something new, something that honors the tradition while acknowledging the reality of modern warfare and human psychology. That would take courage. Yes, it would. More courage than dying. Because living with this kind of pain, making the choice to continue despite the weight, that's the hardest thing a warrior can do. Yamamoto sat in silence, the handkerchief crumpled in his fist, and felt something he hadn't felt since before Okinawa, the possibility of a future. Not happiness, he couldn't imagine happiness again, but existence with purpose beyond death. Survival not as failure, but as obligation. He thought about Private Tanaka's letters, burning undelivered. About Sergeant Yoshida's poetry, lost to fire. About all the small human stories that would be forgotten unless someone remembered. "If I live," Yamamoto said slowly, "I want to tell their stories, write them down, make sure they're not forgotten." "That's a good purpose," Kellerman said. "That's worth living for." "The other officers will say I've been corrupted by American thinking." "Maybe you have been. Or maybe you've just been given permission to think differently than you were trained to. Either way, it's your choice." Yamamoto nodded slowly. He stood, bowed formally to Kellerman, not the mocking bow of earlier sessions, but a genuine gesture of respect. "Thank you, Lieutenant." "You're welcome, Captain. I'll see you Thursday." As Yamamoto walked back to his quarters, he felt the eyes of the other officers tracking his movement. He knew what they saw. A man who had entered Kellerman's office carrying certainty and emerged carrying questions. A man who had gone to therapy as a test subject and returned changed. The test had yielded results. Now came the harder part. Learning whether those results were acceptable to anyone other than himself. He smiles occasionally. He speaks during meals. He has stopped the self-destructive behaviors that concerned us. Your methods appear to have some effect. I'm glad to hear he's improving. That depends on one's definition of improvement. You have convinced him to live with dishonor rather than correcting it through proper means. Some would call this corruption rather than improvement. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, studying the Major carefully. "You didn't come here to debate philosophy, Major. What do you want?" Ishikawa appreciated the directness. Americans, he had learned, valued efficiency over elaborate courtesy. "I want to understand your methods. Not for myself, I have no need of therapy, but for my men. We have lost 8 soldiers to suicide since arriving at this camp. 8 men who believed death was preferable to captivity. If your methods can prevent more deaths, I need to understand them." Even if those methods contradict Bushido? Especially if they contradict Bushido, because Bushido, as we practiced it, led to magnificent deaths and strategic failure. Perhaps it is time to consider whether honor might include survival. The admission clearly cost Ishikawa something. Kellerman could see it in the tightness around the Major's eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. This was a man trained from childhood to value death over dishonor, now asking whether that training might be wrong. "What specifically do you want to know?" Kellerman asked. "How did you convince Yamamoto that living was acceptable?" "I didn't convince him of anything. I helped him examine his assumptions and reach his own conclusions." "That is not an answer. That is evasion." Kellerman smiled slightly. "Fair enough. The method I used with Yamamoto is called cognitive restructuring. It's based on the idea that our thoughts create our emotions and our emotions drive our behaviors. If we can identify and challenge dysfunctional thoughts, we can change the emotional and behavioral patterns that follow." "Dysfunctional thoughts," Ishikawa repeated. "You consider Bushido to be dysfunctional thinking?" "I consider absolutist thinking to be dysfunctional. The belief that there are only 2 options, perfect honor or necessary death. Reality is more complex than that. There are degrees of honor, shades of meaning, ways to find purpose in survival that don't require you to betray your cultural identity. You speak as if culture is negotiable, as if we can choose which parts to keep and which parts to discard. Isn't that exactly what Japan has been doing for a century?" Kellerman leaned forward. "You adopted Western military structures, Western technology, Western organizational methods. You integrated them with traditional Japanese values to create something new. Why is it impossible to do the same with psychology?"
Ishikawa was silent for a long moment, and Kellerman saw him processing this argument, testing it against his own experience. "What you suggest would require us to admit that our training was incomplete," Ishikawa said finally, "that the military code we devoted our lives to was insufficient for the realities of modern war. Or you could frame it differently. Say that Bushido was perfect for the era it was created in, but war has changed. The psychological stresses of modern warfare, the artillery, the bombing, the industrial scale of death, these things didn't exist when Bushido was developed. It's not a failure of the code, it's an evolution of warfare beyond what the code anticipated." That is a convenient rationalization. Maybe, but it's also true. Major, let me ask you something. How many of your officers are suffering? How many lie awake at night wrestling with the same demons Yamamoto faced? Ishikawa's silence was answer enough.
And how many of them would accept help if it was offered in a way that didn't require them to betray their entire identity? What are you proposing? Let me conduct a group session. 5 or 6 officers who are struggling. I won't try to make them American. I won't ask them to abandon Bushido. I'll just teach them some cognitive techniques for managing intrusive thoughts, processing trauma, dealing with the psychological aftermath of combat. If it helps, continue. If it doesn't, dismiss me as an American fool and we'll never speak of this again." Ishikawa considered this. It was a risk. Exposing more of his officers to Kellerman's methods meant risking more corruption. But the alternative was watching more men die by their own hands, their potential wasted, their knowledge lost. "I will select 6 officers," Ishikawa said finally. "They will attend your group session, but I will attend as well, to observe and ensure that nothing inappropriate occurs." "That's acceptable." "And Lieutenant Kellerman? If your methods harm any of my men, if they cause more psychological damage than they heal, I will hold you personally responsible." "I understand, Major. That's a risk I'm willing to take." They stood simultaneously, and Ishikawa bowed, a gesture of formal respect between equals. Kellerman returned the bow, carefully matching the angle and duration, showing that he understood the significance of the gesture. After Ishikawa left, Kellerman sat alone in the consultation room and allowed himself a moment of doubt. He was navigating uncharted territory, trying to apply Western psychology to Eastern military culture, attempting to help men whose values and training were fundamentally different from anything he'd studied in graduate school. His brother's voice echoed in his memory. "I'm sorry for being weak." Weakness, that's what his brother had believed depression was. That's what these Japanese officers believed their suffering was. The fundamental misunderstanding that psychological pain indicated character failure rather than human response to inhuman conditions. If Kellerman could help even a few of them understand that suffering wasn't weakness, that asking for help wasn't betrayal, that survival could be its own form of courage, then maybe his brother's death would have meaning. Maybe this work would justify the year he'd spent becoming a soldier instead of remaining a psychologist. He picked up his journal and began planning the group session, knowing that he had one chance to prove that therapy could bridge cultures, could honor tradition while acknowledging reality, could save lives without destroying identity. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the test was about to expand. The group session took place on a Wednesday evening in a larger room that usually served as the officers' common area. Kellerman had arranged chairs in a circle, deliberately choosing a configuration that implied equality rather than hierarchy. Major Ishikawa sat in the circle as well, not as participant, but as observer. His presence a reminder that this was happening under Japanese command structure, not American control. The 6 officers Ishikawa had selected represented a range of ages, branches, and experiences. Besides Yamamoto, there was Lieutenant Commander Nakamura from the Navy, Captain Hayashi from artillery, Lieutenant Tanaka, the young officer who had defended therapy in the earlier meeting,
and 2 others. Captain Ito, a signals officer who had lost his entire communications company at Palaleo, and Major Kurita, a tank commander whose unit had been destroyed in the Philippines. They sat stiffly, their faces showing varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. None of them wanted to be here, but all of them had obeyed Ishikawa's order to attend. "Thank you for coming," Kellerman began, speaking in English but slowly enough that those with limited fluency could follow.
I want to start by making something clear. Nothing you say here will be reported to American intelligence or used against you. This is a medical session, protected by the same confidentiality as any doctor-patient relationship. "We are prisoners of war," Colonel Saito said flatly. "There is no confidentiality. You will report everything to your superiors. I report that sessions occur and whether individuals are improving. I don't report content. That's standard medical practice. American medical practice, not Japanese." Kellerman acknowledged this with a nod. "Fair point. Let me ask you something instead. Why did you agree to come?" Silence. The officers looked at each other, unwilling to admit vulnerability in front of peers. Finally, young Lieutenant Tanaka spoke. "Because I'm tired of pretending I'm not suffering. Because I've been having nightmares for 8 months, and I'm exhausted, and I don't know how to make them stop." The honesty was shocking in its directness. The other officers stared at Tanaka, who met their gazes with something close to defiance. "That's a good start," Kellerman said. "Nightmares are a normal response to trauma. Anyone else experiencing them?" Slowly, reluctantly, 5 other hands rose. Only Ishikawa kept his hand down, and even he looked uncomfortable. "Nightmares are your brain's attempt to process events it wasn't designed to handle," Kellerman explained. "During combat, you experience things that are so intense, so overwhelming, that your normal mental filing system gets overloaded. The nightmares are your unconscious mind trying to sort through these experiences and make sense of them." "That is not how we were taught to think about nightmares," Hayashi said. "We were taught that nightmares indicate weakness, that a strong warrior controls his mind even in sleep." "And how's that working for you?" Kellerman asked, not unkindly. "Are you controlling your dreams through willpower?" Hayashi's silence was answer enough. "Here's the thing about trauma," Kellerman continued. "It's not a moral failing. It's an injury. When you break your leg, you don't will it to heal faster. You set the bone, rest it, give it time and proper treatment. Psychological trauma works the same way. You can't just decide to be fine. You need to treat the injury." "And talking is treatment?" Major Kurita asked, his tone skeptical. "Talking is part of treatment, along with other techniques, breathing exercises, sleep hygiene, cognitive reframing. But yes, fundamentally, talking helps because it allows you to externalize the trauma, examine it from a distance, process it in a safe environment, instead of having it ambush you in dreams. This sounds like making excuses for weakness," Kurita said. "Or it sounds like acknowledging reality," Yamamoto interjected. All eyes turned to him. "I thought the same thing, Major. I thought therapy was American weakness, that talking about feelings was dishonor. But Lieutenant Kellerman helped me understand something important. There's a difference between the shame of failure and the grief of loss. I didn't fail my men, I lost them. And grief isn't weakness. It's the price we pay for having cared about them." The room went very quiet. Yamamoto had just articulated something none of them had been able to speak aloud. The fundamental confusion between failure and loss, between dishonor and grief. "Tell me about your men," Kellerman said, addressing the group. "Not how they died, who they were." And slowly, haltingly, they began to talk. Nakamura spoke about his executive officer, a brilliant tactician who had been killed by American aircraft while their destroyer was sinking. Hayashi described his battery commander, an old soldier who had fought in China and knew more about artillery than any officer in the Imperial Army. Tanaka talked about his platoon, boys from his hometown who had trusted him and died following his orders during a night assault that had been doomed from the beginning. As each man spoke, the others listened with the intensity of people recognizing their own experience in another's story. The wall of professional distance began to crack. These weren't just fellow officers, they were fellow sufferers, each carrying similar weights, each struggling with similar demons. And in that recognition, something shifted. "I dream about the fire," Major Kurita said suddenly, his voice rough. "My tank was hit. Fuel tanks ruptured. The crew compartment became an oven. I was in the commander's cupola, got thrown clear by the explosion. But my crew, my driver, my gunner, my loader, they burned. I hear them screaming every night. I smell the burning flesh. And when I wake up, I feel guilty that I can smell it, because it means I'm still alive." "That's survivor's guilt," Kellerman said gently. "It's common among people who survived when others didn't. Your brain is trying to punish you for surviving by replaying the worst moments over and over. As it should, I should have died with them. Why? Because you were the commander? Because I was responsible for them. And you believe responsibility means dying with them? Yes. Then by that logic, every commander who survives a battle has failed. Which would mean every senior officer in this room has failed, since you all survived when men under your command didn't." The logic landed hard. If survivor's guilt was justified, then they were all guilty. If they were all guilty, then the concept became meaningless. And if it was meaningless, then maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about guilt at all. It was about grief dressed up as honor. "This is word games," Saito said. "Manipulation." "No," Ishikawa said quietly, speaking for the first time. Everyone turned to stare at the major. "This is truth. Uncomfortable truth."
We have been trained to believe that death is the only honorable response to loss. But perhaps that training prepared us for a different kind of war. A war where individual death had tactical meaning, where sacrifice changed outcomes. Modern war is different. Death is industrial, random, meaningless. We need different tools to survive it psychologically. "You sound like you've been converted," Saito said accusingly. "I sound like someone who is tired of losing men to suicide," Ishikawa replied. "Tired of watching warriors die not in battle, but in their quarters, alone, believing they have no other option. If Lieutenant Kellerman's methods can give them other options, then I'm willing to listen. Are you?" Saito didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. Kellerman took this as permission to continue. "Let me teach you a technique. It's called grounding. When you're experiencing flashbacks or nightmares or intrusive thoughts, your brain is essentially time-traveling back to the traumatic event. Grounding brings you back to the present. It's simple. You focus on sensory details. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. By the time you finish the sequence, your brain has anchored to the present moment instead of the past." "That is all?" Tanaka asked. "Just counting senses? Try it next time you have a nightmare. The moment you wake up, before panic sets in, do the sequence. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tell me next week if it helped." The session continued for another hour. Kellerman taught them breathing exercises for managing anxiety, explained the neuroscience of trauma in terms simple enough to understand but scientific enough to be credible, and gave them homework, keeping journals where they wrote about 1 positive memory each day, no matter how small. It was basic trauma therapy, adapted on the fly for a culture that had no vocabulary for psychology and a military tradition that equated emotional expression with weakness. Kellerman had no idea if it would work. But as the officers filed out, several of them nodded to him with something approaching respect, and Yamamoto lingered behind, waiting until the others had left. "Thank you," Yamamoto said quietly, "for doing this. Thank you for speaking up. You gave them permission to admit they were suffering. Major Ishikawa was right. This is uncomfortable truth, but it's better than comfortable lies. As Kellerman cleaned up the room, returning chairs to their original positions, he felt exhausted but oddly hopeful. He thought about his brother, about the note that said, "I'm sorry for being weak." He thought about all the soldiers who believed suffering was shameful, that asking for help was dishonorable, that death was preferable to vulnerability. Maybe therapy couldn't cure everyone. Maybe some wounds were too deep. But if he could help even a few people understand that suffering was human, that grief was natural, that survival was strength, then maybe this work mattered. Maybe his brother's death would have meaning after all. Word of the group therapy session spread through the Japanese officers' quarters like radiation, invisible but pervasive, affecting everyone it touched. The reactions were mixed. Some officers, particularly the older ones trained in the most traditional interpretation of Bushido, saw it as contamination. American ideas infecting Japanese minds, weakening the warrior spirit with soft Western psychology. They avoided the officers who had attended, treating them with formal courtesy but underlying coldness, as if exposure to therapy was contagious. Others, particularly the younger officers and those who had experienced the worst of the modern warfare's psychological toll, were curious. They approached Yamamoto and the others privately, asking questions in low voices. Did it help? Did it feel like betrayal? Was it possible to accept American therapy without abandoning Japanese identity? The camp effectively split into three factions: traditionalists who rejected therapy entirely, modernists who cautiously embraced it, and the uncertain majority who watched and waited to see which approach would prevail. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura became an unlikely advocate. In the 3 weeks following the group session, his nightmares had decreased from nightly occurrences to perhaps twice a week. The grounding technique actually worked. When he woke gasping from dreams of his ship sinking, he would lie in his bunk and systematically catalog his surroundings until the panic subsided. "It's not a cure," he told anyone who asked, "but it's a tool. Like learning to navigate by stars. You still feel lost, but you have reference points." Lieutenant Tanaka took to the journaling exercise with unexpected enthusiasm, filling pages with memories of pre-war life, small moments of beauty that had nothing to do with combat. He read some entries aloud during meals, sharing stories of festivals and family and the ordinary life they'd all left behind. Major Kurita remained skeptical, but continued attending sessions. "I don't believe in this psychology nonsense," he would say, "but I sleep better after talking. Make of that what you will." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Colonel Saito, the oldest and most traditionally minded officer who had been the most vocal opponent of therapy. 3 weeks after the first group session, Saito requested a private meeting with Kellerman. He arrived at the consultation room with rigid formality, his face showing no emotion, his posture military perfect. "Lieutenant Kellerman," he began, "I wish to understand something. Your therapy methods have shown effect on my fellow officers. This troubles me because it suggests that our traditional approaches to warrior psychology are incomplete. I am 70 years old. I have devoted my entire life to Bushido. If I accept that it is insufficient, I must question everything I have believed. Or," Kellerman said carefully, "you could accept that Bushido is not insufficient, just different. It provides one set of tools for one set of circumstances. Psychology provides additional tools for additional circumstances. They don't have to contradict each other." "How can they not contradict? Bushido teaches that emotion must be controlled, that suffering should be endured in silence. Your psychology teaches that emotion should be expressed, that suffering should be shared. These are opposite approaches. Are they? Or are they appropriate for different situations?" Kellerman leaned forward.
Colonel, you command men in battle. In that moment, emotional control is critical. You can't have officers breaking down in combat. You need discipline, focus, the ability to function despite fear. That's what Bushido provides. But after the battle, when you're processing what happened, maybe a different approach is needed. Expression instead of suppression. Sharing instead of isolation. You suggest that we should be one person in battle and another person after. I suggest that you're already doing that. You're just not acknowledging it. You're human, Colonel. You feel fear and grief and doubt like everyone else. Bushido teaches you to suppress those feelings in combat, but they don't disappear just because you suppress them. They accumulate. They grow heavier. Eventually, the weight becomes unbearable. Saito was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of its formal tone. I had a son, captain in the Imperial Guards. He was killed at Guadalcanal. When I received notification of his death, I conducted the mourning rituals properly. I did not cry. I did not show weakness. I honored his sacrifice in the traditional way. But every night I dream of him as a child, playing in our garden, laughing, and when I wake, the grief is as fresh as the day I learned he died. I have suppressed it during waking hours for 3 years, but I cannot suppress my dreams. Your dreams are trying to help you process the grief you won't allow yourself to feel while awake. Then how do I stop the dreams? You don't stop them, you honor them. You allow yourself to grieve fully and completely, not as failure, but as love. Saito looked at Kellerman with eyes that had seen 70 years of life, 5 wars, and more death than any person should have to witness. You are asking me to abandon a lifetime of training, to show weakness at my age when I should be a model of strength. I'm asking you to show humanity, which is different from weakness. Colonel, you loved your son. That love doesn't disappear because he died. It has to go somewhere. Right now, it's going into dreams and suppressed grief that's slowly destroying you from the inside. What if you let it out? What if you allowed yourself to mourn him properly? Not according to ritual, but according to what you actually feel. That would mean crying, which I have not done since I was a child. Yes, it probably would. And you believe this would help? I believe it would be honest, and I believe honesty is the foundation of healing. Saito stood, his movements stiff with age and dignity. I will consider what you have said, but I make no promises. That's all I ask. After Saito left, Kellerman sat alone and wondered if he had pushed too hard. Saito was from a different generation, formed by different values, shaped by a culture that Kellerman could study but never fully understand. Maybe asking a 70-year-old samurai to embrace Western psychology was asking too much. Maybe some wounds were too deep, some traditions too strong. But 3 days later, during the next group session, Saito attended. He sat in the circle with the others, rigid and uncomfortable, but present. And when Kellerman asked if anyone wanted to share, Saito raised his hand. I had a son, he began, his voice formal but shaking slightly. His name was Takeo. He was 28 years old when he died at Guadalcanal. He was my only child. The room went silent. Every officer there understood what it meant for Saito to speak of this, to violate the code of silent suffering, to acknowledge grief in front of subordinates, to show emotion that traditional training deemed weakness. I have not mourned him properly, Saito continued, each word seeming to cost him something. I have suppressed my grief for 3 years, believing that to show sorrow was to dishonor his sacrifice. But Lieutenant Kellerman has suggested that my dreams are trying to force me to process what I will not process while awake. And I am tired. I am tired of dreaming of my son as a child and waking to remember he is dead.
I am tired of pretending that grief is something shameful rather than something human." And then, in front of his fellow officers, Colonel Saito began to cry. It was not loud sobbing or dramatic grief. It was quiet weeping, tears running down weathered cheeks, the kind of crying that came from a place so deep that it had been locked away for years. And the most remarkable thing was that none of the other officers looked away. None of them showed disgust or disapproval. Instead, they bore witness. They honored his grief with their attention. When Saito finally regained control, he looked around the circle and saw not judgment, but recognition. Every man there had lost someone. Every man there carried similar grief. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, something fundamental changed. "Thank you," Yamamoto said quietly, "for showing us that grief is not weakness."
"Thank you," Saito replied, "for having the courage to begin this process. You made it possible for the rest of us to follow." After the session, as the officers filed out, Major Ishikawa approached Kellerman. "That was significant," Ishikawa said. "If Saito can accept therapy, can show emotion in front of subordinates, then the resistance to your methods has effectively ended. He is our moral authority. His approval legitimizes everything you're trying to do. I'm glad it helped him. You should be. You've done something remarkable here, Lieutenant. You found a way to bridge cultures without erasing identity. You've made it possible for Japanese officers to accept American psychology without abandoning Bushido. That's no small achievement. The achievement is theirs, not mine. I just gave them tools. They did the hard work of using them." Ishikawa nodded slowly. "We have a saying, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. But sometimes standing up is necessary. You stood up. Captain Yamamoto stood up. Now Colonel Saito has stood up. Perhaps it is time for all of us to stand." As Ishikawa walked away, Kellerman felt something he hadn't felt since arriving at the camp: genuine hope. Not naive optimism, but realistic hope grounded in actual progress. These men were still prisoners. They still carried tremendous trauma. They still faced uncertain futures, but they were learning to live with their wounds instead of dying from them. And that was worth something. That was worth everything.